Next up, we have Philip Arneill, a Belfast-born writer and photographer. His writing has been published in The Guardian, Honest Ulsterman, Ropes and the Storms. Please welcome Philip to the stage to read an excerpt from his story entitled Gravedigger of the Year.
I'm thrilled to be here, so thank you. And this is my story, Gravedigger of the Year. This was inspired by a throwaway conversation with someone I work with, who is a funeral consultant. I didn't know that was a thing. And then she told me that she just got back from Las Vegas from a funeral convention there, and I could only imagine what that's like. So this story was inspired by that. The sun squeaking through the shed window only made the chip on the glass trophy more apparent. Its elongated hexagonal shape with one corner missing had lost its satisfying symmetry. Khalid paid little attention to it from one week to the next, but on the odd day when the sun did shine, it tended to spill through temporarily and illuminate the trophy as a reminder of its presence. You couldn't really display a small glass coffin at home, so it had found its resting place here, clinging to the edge of a crowded shelf. The very idea had struck Khalid as odd, and being flown to the world's biggest funeral convention in Las Vegas only served to underscore the strangeness. Khalid hadn't entered the competition. Rather, he'd been nominated for the award by his boss, a well-meaning type who dropped out of the pressure of a high-paid job because life's too short. Now he whiled away the days managing a small team of cemetery workers, seemingly oblivious to the irony. Their official title was maintenance engineers, which made Khalid chuckle when he'd first received his name badge. He had studied actual engineering to doctorate level, mechanical to be precise, so it seemed like odd nomenclature for this ragtag bunch of 8 strangers who came together each day like clockwork for their 3 designated breaks. Gravedigger of the Year, proclaimed the trophy in carefully recessed lettering. The story of how he'd ended up in this wet and dreary corner of the world was one he'd never really told anyone. And the longer he left it, the quicker they all slipped into safe, familiar patterns of interaction. People here seemed to him to have mastered the art of saying something by saying nothing, or saying nothing by saying something. He'd quickly learned a few fillers like, aye, and well, and a distinctive, short, sharp intake of breath, the sound of which seemed to stand in for a range of emotions from interest to surprise and concern. Khalid had grown used to being asked where he was from, and when he told people, it provoked the same series of responses that he himself had adopted to keep others at bay. On the whole, though, he found people to be kind, and the boss, despite Khalid's rolled-up prayer mat clearly visible in the shed, even tried a few times to recruit him to his church group. He went once out of politeness and was welcomed warmly with emphatic double-grip handshakes and milky coffees, but the whole thing felt more like an overcrowded cafe than a house of God. The first Khalid had learned of the award was the day the congratulatory letter arrived. It took 3 or 4 attempts from the boss to explain to him what it was he'd actually won. Khalid knew he was good at what he did. He took pride in his work too, whereas most of the others were all about getting the graves done and back to the shed as quickly as possible. Khalid, however, wanted to do it right, to be precise, and he worked efficiently but meticulously, finishing off the edges by hand with a shovel and hoe. Even then, it was never quite perfect. Maybe this is what drove him forward. The damp, earthy rectangle cut from the luscious green grass gave him strange comfort. The lines were as stark as the contrast with the piles of dusty soil he'd once been forced to dig back home. They'd been large, open pits dried out instantly from the blazing sun, the muzzle of a gun ever visible in Khalid's peripheral vision. He'd been sacked from his job at the university, lost his home, and was left with no choice but to do what he was told, and that was to dig. They all knew what for. The fear had grown rapidly that he'd someday be digging one of these pits for himself. So through an old school friend and some cash he'd managed to keep concealed, he'd made it out alive after a treacherous 3-day trek to one of the lesser guarded areas of the sprawling northern border. Through a combination of luck and some chance encounters, he'd escaped from a city framed by the towering Hindu Kush and ended up in a country where the mountains, as beautiful as they were barely qualified as large hills by comparison. Now, Khalid, I've had a fair few maintenance engineers on my team, the boss had explained. And they were all either quick or meticulous, but never both. But you? Well, you deliver quality and quantity. So I put you forward for this. I hope you don't mind. I just thought, especially with, well, you know. He looked like he was willing Khalid to complete the sentence. But Khalid didn't know, really, nor did the boss. So he simply smiled back and unfolded the letter again, raising it slightly towards his boss to indicate thanks. He'd had to take this job to qualify for a flat, and now the monthly obligation of rent meant that he had to keep it, which had somehow given him this. Thank you.